Chiaroscuro is mostly known as a mainstream, traditional kind of label. I mean, it went all the way from, a Dixieland thing with Wild Bill Davison to Eddie Condon kind of stuff to Mary Lou Williams in its early incarnation. I mean, because you can't ever think of Mary Lou Williams as an old-time piano player. She was as out there as anybody. And Earl Hines, what Earl was doing at the end of his life, in any event. But my musical interests were always somewhat broader than that, in that, particularly from a listening standpoint, and still are. And I once met a man named John Hart, because I helped him. I forget who introduced me to John, but John wanted to record two solo pianists, a piano duo, a group called Phillips and Renzulli, and they played Brahms and stuff like that, duo piano things. And I did it at Sherman's house because he had two Max Steinways, and he remained a friend. And he went to work for the Record Club of America eventually, and he managed to convince them to pick up all the Chiaroscuro catalog, which really helped us a lot. Sold a few copies. But more importantly, one of the perks was that they allowed me to buy finished Chiaroscuro records for 50 or 60 cents a piece, which enabled me to, resell them at wholesale for $2 or $2.25, whatever it was, and make enough money to make another record. But anyway, one day John told me that he had heard a phenomenal piano player whose name was Bora Bergman. And said, you got to go hear this guy. So I checked it out, and Bora was really quite a phenomenal player. His passion in life was to have the strongest left hand of any piano player in the world. And he would put a 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 pound weight on his wrist that he would strap on his wrist, and then he'd play. Not for 5 minutes, but for half an hour. And the music that Bora was making sort of made the music that Cecil Taylor was making at the time sound a bit like Jelly Roll Morton. I mean, it was really out there. And I thought that was fun. So I said, come on, Bora, let's make a record. Anyway, the first Bora Bergman record, I mean, it was so complicated that I finally wound up teaching Bora how to work all the equipment, because Bora would come in and play all night long. And he would do a half-hour tape, and then he'd listen to it. If he didn't, he'd just record over it. Anyway, I wound up with a pile of Bora Bergman things about like so. But that was the first avant-garde kind of record that I did, the first of many. Because the Warp Studios and then Downtown Sound was a place where a lot of people recorded other than myself. And I remember the first time that Dollar Brand, then Abdul Abraham now, came in with a project for India. I mean, it was really wonderful and out there. It was called African Space Program or something like that. And we did that record. I really liked what he was doing. Ultimately wound up making, 3 records with Abdullah, and licensing a lot of his stuff from South Africa and putting that out here. And then in about 1977, well, to back up just a second, in maybe 1974 or 5, wonderful bass player who's best known sort of for performing with Bill Evans, named Chuck Israels, had a group called the National Jazz Ensemble, and they were playing over at the New School, where I was busily teaching people to do one thing and another. And they needed a place to rehearse, and they came in and they said, well, let's not just rehearse, let's make a record. And we wound up making a 2-record set, and that's the first time I ever heard Tom Harold, and he was on that record, and we wound up so was Lee Konitz, and so was Bill Evans, and people like that. And so my interest went beyond the mainstream stuff. The reason I stuck with that for so long, though, was because Bill Evans wasn't having a hard time getting recorded, and Joe Venuti was. And these guys were so much older, and so I did those things. An interesting thing has just happened in the last 3 or 4 months with regard to some of that material. In 1977, I believe it was, a guy who had come in to take over the day-to-day operations of Audio Fidelity Enterprises, which was the company that was distributing my stuff at the time, called me in and said, Hank, and it was at the height of the people who were doing tax shelter records. The people who were doing tax shelter movies had, moved over to doing tax shelter records. And Bill Gallagher said, this is an ideal way to build a catalog. And he said, Hank, I've got 20,000 tax shelter dollars. Can you make 10 records? And I said, if you don't charge any studio costs, I can. And he said, I want you to go find 10 largely unknown people and try to make a good record. And I did. I actually only made 8 because I just ran out of time. They all had to be done by the end of calendar year 77. In calendar year 77, I made 50 records in 52 weeks. But one of the records that I did was with a marvelous artist whose name is Joan Labarbera. You've never heard of her. Or if maybe you've seen on the CHIAROSCURO list that she's there. Joan at the time was one of the foremost avant-garde vocalists that there was in the United States. She was late 20s, going out with a guy who was prominent in avant-garde jazz circles at the time, named Bruce Ditmus. He was a percussionist. So I hired both Bruce and Joan to make records. And to put the Bruce Ditmus one into proper context, most of it was on synthesizers, and percussion, and trumpet. The trumpet player was Enrico Rava, the noted Italian trumpet player. Joan's record was all Joan electronics and Bruce on percussion. Now, to put this record into context, the liner notes were written by John Cage, and one of the compositions on the record was by John Cage, which makes it somewhat distant from Willie the Lion Smith. And although John Cage would have liked Willie the Lion Smith, and I'm sure did, because somewhere in the archives I have a picture of John Cage sitting on the floor at Squirrel Ashcraft's house at an informal jam session in the late 1930s. Anyway, Joan's record was all electronics, all percussion, and vocal. And I mean, it's not like singing Melancholy Baby or anything like that. It's just vocal noises and sounds and stuff. And by that time, I was taking a lot of the record cover photographs because I had a wonderful studio in which I could do all that kind of thing. And I wanted to do something very special for Joan. She told me that she wanted to call the record Tape Songs. So what I did was, a friend had sent over to the studio about 50 boxes like that, of half-inch recording tape that he didn't have a place to store and didn't want any longer and so forth. So what I did was that I jerry-rigged a system where I took about maybe 40 rolls of tape, fixed a coat hanger, and hung it from a water pipe in the ceiling and let the tape just spool down onto the floor. And I wound up with a pile of tape about this high and that wide. And Joni came down to take pictures for the record cover, and I had told her just to, wear a leotard or something like that. And she came in and sees this big pile of tape. And I had set up the camera. We were directly under a skylight, so it was all natural light. And she just got into the tape and played in it, and then ultimately fashioned it into a dress that it was just from here to the floor of her covered in tape. I mean, not a little tape, a lot of tape. And the cover generated a lot of chat and stuff like that. It actually wound up on the cover of a book about the most interesting record covers and this and that 10 years ago or so. But anyway, about 3 or 4 months ago, I was contacted by a bunch of people who were running a poetry festival in Madrid, and Joan was going to be one of the primary people there. And they asked if they could use that photograph for their poster. And I said, be my guest. And then about a week after that, they called and said, would you be willing to try and take the picture again 40 years later? So I says, I've got to find tape. And they said, well, we'll get the tape. And I said, well, how much are you going to be paying for tape? They said, we have a source in Germany that we can get it for $80 a reel. And I said, well, you're going to need about 40 or 50. Oh. So anyway, I called some friends, and we still had tape left over from Downtown Sound that John Bates had stored in a barn. And I made a pile of tape this big. And Joni came in, and we recreated the photograph in the studio downstairs. And she, got in the pile of tape and dressed herself just as she had done before. The new photograph of it was plastered all over Madrid the first week of June. They even went so far as to make a big version of the photograph with a hole cut where Joan's head was, so people at the festival could put their own head in and be taken in the tape out. So CHIAROSCURO lived another day in Madrid, but many of the more non-traditional recordings that were made in the 70s went on to have very interesting lives. James Mason's record, there was a time if you wanted to buy a James Mason record or a Tarika Blue record that we made and get an original vinyl that was in good shape, you could pay $250, $300 for them because they were sort of jazz funk kind of things that had major people that had become stars or whatever. The last Abdullah Ibrahim Dollar Brand thing, it was with Don Cherry and people like that. And so CHIAROSCURO was not just this old funky butt stuff, but it was a whole bunch of other things. And then in 1978, Audio Fidelity proposed to me that they wanted to buy the company. And they offered, a decent price. Plus, they said they would give me my recording studio. You see, I ran the studio. I had built the first one, but they had put $250,000 into the second version of it, where we totally rebuilt it all out of redwood and brought big multi-track, 16-track this and that, and made it a really fancy place. So I said, fine. I don't have to own something to enjoy it. And so I made a deal with them. It ultimately turned sour because they stopped paying, and it took until about 1982 to get all of the what they owed me paid. Had to get lawyers after them. The only reason it worked was that somebody else had come in and bought the company, and the guy he bought it from, who didn't want to pay me, a guy named Herman Gimbel, and he got sent away. A guy named Danny Puglisi came in and bought the company and ultimately paid the bills and stuff. And then in 1986, I met Andy Sordoni on one of my jazz cruises, and we talked about one thing and another, and Andy's a big jazz fan, and that resulted in 1987, we bought CHIAROSCURO back from Danny Puglisi, who was perfectly happy to have it, to get rid of it, and at a very good price. And I remember going out to, because Dan was in trouble because of, to back up a minute, the problem that Audio Fidelity had was, at the end, it wasn't that they were, the ownership had the feeling that if you took advantage of someone to the tune of $5 million, they're going to come get you. But if you took advantage of 50 people to the tune of $100,000, or 100 people to $50,000, they aren't going to bother. And I remember there was one example of the Harry Fox agency came in to see Audio Fidelity and to check the books. You guys haven't been paying your mechanicals and stuff. And they did this audit, and Audio Fidelity owed them $150,000 or something. And the young man who had done the audit, he was very proud of himself and things. And so he's sitting across from Herman Gimbel, who ran the company, and Herman said, well, I'm not going to pay you. And like that. And he doesn't know quite what to say, and Herman opens his desk drawer, takes out an envelope, and said, "But here's $10,000 for you. Would you please just go away?" And he did. But what happened was, in 1988, about maybe 8 or 9 months after Andy and I bought all of the assets of CHIAROSCURO back, and I had gone out and taken all of the master tapes and this and that out of their storage places, Harry Fox came in again to see Audio Fidelity, and now it was up to well over $1 million that they owed and stuff. And this time the guy didn't go away, and they effectively forbid them to ever make another record, and they were put out of business. They did have a side business which was making inexpensive videotapes and stuff like that. But if we had done it, 5 months differently in terms of buying the tapes, the sale would have been null and void, because it has to have been at least 6 months before you get thrown out or they throw out the sale. So that would have meant that all those chiaroscuros just went into the bucket, because what ultimately happened with chiaroscuro was we continued to reissue the LPs as CDs and make, 75 or 80 new CDs, new recordings of one sort and another. Audio Fidelity, who had all of our material, was ultimately sold to a company in England in about 1993, and for $110,000 or $20,000. And when the company in England went to collect their property, I believe they got about 2 boxes of master tapes. Now, when I took the master tapes off the shelves for chiaroscuro, it was in a room 3 times the size of my office with nothing but metal shelving with thousands of master tapes. Audio Fidelity had been in business since the early 50s. Nothing was left. It was all gone. Now, they bought the rights, but they had no tapes. So anything they wanted to use had to be a needle drop from a new recording, or a recording that was in really good condition. And